Today we are covering the weird and sad story of a small town in America where a wife swap arrangement that started consensually led to the murder of the other wife. Stick around as we unravel the twisted events that took this fantasy into a nightmare. Summer of 2014. An unassuming suburb of Indiana, what to many would seem to be the background of an American dream, complete with white picket fences. Two families, the Devereaux and the Wilkersons, bucked the trend of the community expectation for nice homes and good jobs with children in private schools. Behind closed doors, however, brewed something much more complicated. Mark and Cindy Devereaux had been married for more than 10 years. Mark was an IT manager, and Cindy had a small business that she ran from home. Life was comfortable, but their marriage wasn't without cracks. Over the years, the couple had grown apart, and their relationship felt more and more like roommates rather than lovers. But to everyone on the outside, the picture of the Devereaux seemed perfect. On the other side, you had Greg and Amanda Wilkerson. Greg was a former military man, now working in private security, and Amanda was a stay-at-home mom. They lived just a few houses down from the Devereaux, and their children went to the same school. The two families had met at a neighborhood barbecue and quickly became close friends. What started as casual dinner parties soon evolved into something darker and far more dangerous. Both marriages had their issues, with an emerging sense of monotony and dissatisfaction. It was during one of those late-night get-togethers, replete with drinks and shedding inhibitions, that the matter turned serious. From a joke about how to spice things up, the conversation gradually focused on trying a wife swap arrangement. It wasn't until after months of consideration that either of the couples had decided to go through with the switch. Convinced it would be harmless and a good idea to bring the spark back into their relationships with no real repercussions, they were about to find out how wrong they could be. The arrangement. The first wife swap night was arranged for a weekend when their kids would be away. Mark would be spending the night with Amanda, while Greg would be with Cindy. It seemed like a clear, no-strings deal. There were ground rules in place: no emotional attachment, full disclosure if things changed, and strict adherence to keeping the swap as a one-time deal. At least on the surface, the night itself passed without incident. Both couples followed through with the arrangement and were happy, it seemed, that they had tried something new. The aftermath of that night, however, would prove much more complicated than they had anticipated. What had started as a one-time experiment soon escalated into something else entirely. Soon, Cindy and Greg were text messaging in private, well outside of the parameters set by the original agreement. The messages between them grew flirtatious, and the affair was on. The changed behavior in their spouses began to dawn on Mark and Amanda. Mark felt that Cindy was growing distant and secretive, while Amanda sensed the mood swings of Greg, who, she felt, was slowly drawing away from her. Everyone was shocked by the sudden flip-flop in the relationship between Greg and Cindy, though it was slow and almost insidious. Initially, they thought that they were going to keep it professional. After all, we're just neighbors, and the switch was a fun one-time affair. However, soon it seemed that every passing encounter between them was imbued with new intensity. Every look lingered a little longer, every casual touch of hands in gatherings was given more meaning, and their stolen moments of texting became a secret world. The adrenaline rush from sneaking around adds excitement to what initially had been dull daily life. For Cindy, it was an escape from the routine that Cindy had with Mark, the one that had become stale for years. For Greg, then, it was an outlet for emotions not really dealt with and expressed. Soon, however, they turned the excitement of secretly seeing each other into something neither of them could try to stay in control of. It was only a matter of time, however, before cracks in the relationship began to show. Greg started missing work more and more often, and Amanda couldn't help but wonder why a man who was once so involved with his wife had now become so communicative and reclusive. She began paying attention to small things first, an occasional late return home, and secretive texting. Meanwhile, Mark felt a lingering feeling that something was amiss about Cindy. She was detached, constantly distant, and lost interest in saving the relationship between them. Both of them began noticing changes, but it was already too late at that stage. By this time, the affair was in full swing. Cindy and Greg were seeing each other in secret, neither able to resist the attraction of their newly formed connection. Both had been seduced into the excitement of the forbidden, but neither had any idea how out of control things would get. Mark was no fool. For weeks, his instincts had been nagging at him, but he didn't want to believe that his wife Cindy could betray him like this. Long silences during conversations, the late nights she spent working, and how she stayed glued to her phone added up to what he somehow didn't want to believe. Each time he brought it up to Cindy, she managed to dismiss it as work-related stress or that he must be hallucinating. But when Mark checked Cindy's phone that night, he knew he hadn't been paranoid after all. The texts between her and Greg, unmistakably flirty and intimate, jumped off the phone with references to nights they had spent together. The reality of the affair hit him like a freight train. The first reaction had been denial, but that soon turned into uncontrollable anger. His hands were shaking as he was scrolling through the messages, each authenticating that the worst fears were true. He could not unsee what was in front of him. It all came to a head on the night of July 15th, 2014. Mark had been suspicious for several weeks now, and finally confirmed his worst fears. He checked her phone that evening when she was in the shower, and a string of incriminating texts was there between her and Greg. The messages hardly left room for doubt, and it was certain that they had been seeing each other behind his back. Mark was infuriated and confronted Cindy the moment she came out of the bathroom. This was an explosive argument. Mark felt betrayed and heartbroken and wanted answers. Cindy tried to downplay it. As they yelled at each other, Cindy collapsed in a heap, tearfully confessing the affair. Outraged, Mark raced out of the house, running down the street to the Wilkersons to have it out with Greg. Around this time, Amanda too had become suspicious of Greg's behavior. She had seen the signs but didn't want to believe that her husband would ever betray her. That night, though, she could no longer shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. One night, Greg sat in the living room, texting on his phone, and Amanda finally confronted him. Initially, Greg denied everything, but Amanda wasn't convinced. She asked him to show her his phone. Of course, he refused, and it was then crystal clear to her that her suspicions were not so wrong after all. The tension was high in the Wilkerson home as Amanda yelled and Greg deflected. About the time it would seem things couldn't boil over anymore, there was a knock at the door. It was Mark, fuming, ready to fight. When Greg opened the door, Mark immediately launched into a furious tirade of accusations about Greg ruining his marriage. Already on an emotional edge from his argument with Amanda, Greg wasn't in the mood to de-escalate the situation at hand. He shot back, and in a matter of moments, the two men were yelling at the top of their lungs. Cindy arrived briefly thereafter, having followed Mark from their house. She entered the house in a suicide attempt to intervene, but by that time, things were well out of hand. The tension was high in the room, as all four of them yelled accusations and insults at each other. Cindy knew exactly where he was headed. Running down the street, pounding through the concrete, finally realizing the situation she had put herself into, playing with fire. For all intent and purposes, things were now getting totally out of hand. Upon arrival at the Wilkersons, a scene awaited her that she wished she hadn't witnessed. Mark was already there, his face red with fury, screaming accusations at Greg, who was standing in the doorway, just as enraged. Amanda stood to the side, tears welling in her eyes as she watched her husband square off with their neighbor. The room was so charged with tension, Cindy wanted it all to stop. But as she entered the apartment and tried to talk Mark down, she was overwhelmed by her own feelings. She had not anticipated that the argument would escalate. Her cries to remain calm were overpowered by the screaming of Mark and Greg as each became more belligerent. Cindy's efforts to stop the shouting simply seemed to feed the flames. All of a sudden, guilt, fear, and anxiety gripped her at once, rendering her powerless to prevent what seemed inevitable. Then it happened. The court testimony showed that Greg was the first to become physically violent, shoving Mark, who then responded with a punch. At this point, an all-out fight ensued. Amanda and Cindy tried to separate the men, but neither backed down. The situation escalated quickly to the point where Greg, in a rage, grabbed a knife from the counter in the kitchen. It culminated in Greg stabbing Mark several times. Blood splashed into the kitchen, and Cindy screamed for help. Amanda was too shocked to do anything but stand there and watch as Mark's body went limp. An argument that started as a confrontation over infidelity had just turned into a murder scene. The neighbor, hearing the loud commotion, called the police to the Wilkerson residence. Police entered and found Mark lying unresponsive in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Cindy was screaming uncontrollably as Greg, with his eyes open wide in shock, stood there, still clutching the bloody knife in his hand. Amanda was just in shock, unable to wrap her mind around the horrific actions that had just transpired. The Wilkerson family had once been a house of laughter, family dinners, and normal suburban life, and in a matter of moments, it turned into a nightmare. The kitchen became a blood-stained crime scene, with the walls shouting out that some man was dying, and those two helpless women never could have conceived this was going to happen to them. Greg stood stock still, knife in hand, in a trance-like, stunned by the severity of what he had just done. Amanda could not even think of moving. She could only stand there helplessly while her world crumbled before her very eyes. It was quickly replaced by the cacophony of sirens, but for Cindy and Amanda, time stood still. Everything felt so surreal that they felt forced into some awful dream they couldn't wake up from. Cindy collapsed onto the floor, sobs building inside her uncontrollably. Amanda stood frozen inside, her mind racing with disbelief, anger, and unbridled pain. Things would never be the same again. Greg was arrested on the spot and charged with second-degree murder. Cindy and Amanda were taken in for questioning, although neither was charged with any crime. A small town once thought of as quiet and peaceful was left to grapple with the news of the brutal killing. Neighbors who had known both families for years could not quite believe such violence could erupt in their seemingly perfect suburban neighborhood. The trial attracted significant media attention. Greg's defense argued the murder was a crime of passion, sparked by an emotional escalation from the affair and confrontation. They claimed he acted in a moment of rage and jealousy. However, the prosecution portrayed Greg as harboring violent tendencies for years, citing unreported prior aggressive incidents. Cindy was even more emotional, testifying that, yes, she had indeed had the affair, but at no time was this ever to be anything more than an escape from the day-to-day grind that her marriage had become. She spoke of the guilt and shame regarding what had transpired, how she and Greg had allowed a desire to feel excitement again to get the better of them. Amanda, still coming to terms with the death of her husband and the betrayal by her best friend, also testified. Her testimony showed a Greg few knew, one quick to anger, unable to handle his temper. She wished she had seen the signs leading up to the murder and felt very regretful. Her words were laced with so much pain. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury only took 2 days to deliver their verdict. Greg Wilkerson was guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life imprisonment. The judge said the sentence he passed termed actions by Greg as reckless, stirred by jealousy and pride. Both families were left shattered by the outcome. Cindy, unable to face the community, moved away shortly after the trial. Amanda left to raise her children alone and struggled with the emotional toll of losing both her husband and her closest friend in one night. What began as a consensual arrangement to spice up 2 failing marriages ended in a gruesome murder that tore 2 families apart. One night of violence tore asunder the Devereaux and Wilkerson families, once close neighbors and friends. Greg will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the psychological scars on Cindy, Amanda, and their children will never heal. The tragic irony of this case lies in how a seemingly consensual and controlled arrangement unraveled so disastrously. So, what are your thoughts about this case? Do you think it could have been prevented? Let us know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Stay safe, and we'll catch you in the next one.